I first want to welcome everyone to our sixth meeting of our 46th year of the Rotary Club of Dublin and Worthington. We have an excellent meeting today, I think. I'm a little personally biased in that direction, and I'll explain that later. At this point, though, I'd like to introduce Katie McCartney, who will do both our invocation and the Pledge of Allegiance. So, Katie, the floor is yours.
Do we do the pledge first? Or the invocation first?
Do the invocation first.
Okay, thank you. Like, what do I do first? Thank you. All right. Gracious God, as we gather together as Rotarian and friends, we acknowledge that wherever we go, we are always in your presence. We pray that our actions may reflect this awareness. As we seek your nearness and as we count our many blessings in the weeks and in the months ahead, clothe our lives with charity, deepen our lives with loyalty, hallow our lives with integrity. Help us to live our lives so that we may embrace or enhance the future of those whose lives we touch. May your radiant spirit guide us and our loved ones all of our days. Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Katie. At this point, President-elect Steve Perley will introduce any visiting Rotarians and guests and ask for any happy dollars.
Yes, so I'm scrolling through the list here and I don't see any visiting Rotarians, but we do have a guest. Jim, would you like to introduce your guest?
So, and that's a happy dollar too for myself. Today, our guest is Dane D'Alessandro. I will introduce him further regarding his professional credentials, but I consider him our eldest child, and I say consider because legally he did not come to us as a legal child, but came along with his sister. We adopted his sister some 35 plus years ago. And he's been an intimate part of our family and a delight. And I'm quite proud of him and glad he can speak today. And we'll talk a little bit later about his credentials. So, and certainly a happy dollar regarding his presence here today.
And Jim, don't you have another guest?
Yeah, I do have another guest. Yeah. That's my wife, Anita. She wanted, of course, to hear our son also.
Yes, thank you, Anita, for joining us. It's good to see you. I'm just looking through the list. I don't think we have any other guests. Yeah, so we'll just go straight into happy dollars. Who has one? Post in the chat or just speak out because I can't see everybody on my screen. George, I think you're trying to say you have a happy dollar. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
We have a guest at our condo here today, Lou Goring.
Not a guest. Oh.
He's not a guest. I just want to let everybody know Lou joined us and we've had a good time.
Welcome, Lou. Thanks for joining us today. Sorry I missed you.
I have a happy dollar. Our grandson will graduate from a school that teaches you how to work on diesel engines and such. And that takes place in 2 weeks. In 3 weeks, he starts a new job. We've all known that if you have that kind of skill, you can probably get a job this afternoon. and that's exactly what he did. He'll be working for Ag Pro, which is a John Deere outfit, franchise type of thing, clear across the country. And so he lives in Florida. This job is just over the border in Georgia, so near Valdesto. So that's a happy dollar because I want him to start paying into Social Security as fast as he can.
Right. Awesome. Congratulations, Jerry. I have a happy dollar, and it's Rotary related. I believe the communications committee is wrangled two unsuspecting members, Katie McCartney and new member Tara Maxwell, I believe is her last name, Burchett Maxwell. So we're excited to have them. Very excited to get the communications committee kind of going again, and I hope the club is appreciating the newsletters we're sending out, and I think it's only going to get better and better. So happy dollar there. Ro, seems like you have a happy dollar. Unmute.
I do. I put it in the chat. So 2 happy dollars, actually. I was happy to see Lou. Hi, Lou Gorey. It's nice to see you again. And I wanted to share that our granddaughter, Paulette, will start kindergarten here in the next couple of weeks.
Nice. Fantastic.
Steve, I have 2. Our youngest son just started college at Davidson in North Carolina. And our oldest son graduated from Purdue and got a job in the Columbus area.
Fantastic. And I saw you actually have 2 real dollars. So please, just deposit those in that tray that comes out on the side of your laptop or your computer, and I'll make sure to get them to Jennifer. Anybody else have a happy dollar for us?
Steve, this is Nick Lincolnoker. I have a happy dollar that is also Rotary related. I saw in the news yesterday from the World Health Organization that that polio has been eradicated in Africa. The entire continent of Africa is now considered polio free, and so the only 2 countries that are left with wild polio are Pakistan and Afghanistan. So that's great work on everyone who's been a part of that, and I want to maybe dedicate this happy dollar to the work that Alan Grossman's done in our club to fund Polio Plus.
That's awesome. That's a great reason for a happy dollar. Thanks for sharing that. And I'm hoping, Alan, and maybe through RI or the district, we're going to hear more about Polio Plus maybe in October soon. So that's fantastic. Okay, I'll take one more happy dollar. Who's got one for me? Help me go out on a good note. Somebody, save me. Oh, terrible. All right, I'm turning it back over to you, Jim.
Okay. Well, the next is
I'll give you a happy dollar just to make you happy.
Oh, good.
Go for it.
Thank you, Connie. We needed to up boost.
You're
Steve.
welcome.
He's been doing a great job here, and I appreciate your
Thank you.
helping out there. Good. So, announcements, and I think we'll lead off with Nick. Nick has an announcement, and then anyone else, please raise your hand. Nick?
Thank you. And this is for the community service committee, pardon me, which Don has been running the meetings really well, and we're excited to get this committee back up and off the ground for this Rotary year. We do have a meeting coming up tomorrow at 3:30, and if you're interested in joining us for that, you can do so. If you can email Don or me, we will be happy to get you signed up for that. We're looking at putting together some big ideas for this club coming up this year, and things that are sustainable for us and get the Rotary name out in the community even more than it already is. So please consider joining us if you have ideas, or if you can't join us tomorrow afternoon or in the future, at least shoot us an email if you have ideas that you'd like to share.
Looks like Courtney, you had a
Yeah, I do. The International Services Committee is meeting tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Tim will be sending out an invitation sometime later today. But to all of the committee members, I sent out an email yesterday with the agenda and an attachment, and it looked terrible. The print was so small, and it had an attachment inside an attachment, and that was really very confusing. So this morning, I sent out 2 more emails. One that was exclusively the agenda for the meeting tomorrow, and the second one was a clear attachment of the investment policy that we need to talk about tomorrow. So it's 9 o'clock. That's all I have.
other announcements.
Hi, Jim. It's Alan.
Yeah. Good, Alan.
Don't worry, Steve. I'm not going to wait until October to talk about polio. World Polio Day is October 24th, and we are looking for some sort of an event. Getting pizza delivered is going to be really hard, unlike last year where it was really easy. So if anybody has an idea that they'd like to share, I'd love to hear it. Second, we can still use a couple of more members. And so if anybody knows somebody that might think Rotary is cool, we'd appreciate it if you'd invite them to come to one of these meetings. It's really easy to click on it, as you all know. And if you'd like me to have a conversation with them individually or either by Zoom or in person, I'm happy to do that, or even all together, that's fine. And finally, Bill Shantz's memorial golf outing by the Powell Chamber is on September 22nd. Hopefully we'll get something out like maybe today or tomorrow in an email form so that you all can see what that's about. It's at the Safari Golf Course, and we'd love to have anybody that wants to participate, or sponsor a hole, or volunteer, whatever you all think is good to remember Bill, of course. And that's all I've got.
Alan, I'll make sure that goes on the newsletter as well.
Have you seen have I sent you, or have you seen the ones from the chamber, the announcements?
I think I did. Yeah, I've got it. 2 weeks ago,
Okay.
maybe.
Yeah, okay, great, thank you.
Okay, any other announcements? If none, then it's an honor for me, as I've said earlier, to introduce my eldest son, Dane D'Alessandro. Dane is, Dr. D'Alessandro, in fact, is currently the Senior Vice President of Organizational Change Management Center of Excellence for TD Bank in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. Dane has led strategic transformations for financial service companies and regulatory agencies for more than 15 years. He holds his BS in Industrial Management from Carnegie Mellon University, a Master's in Organizational Science from George Washington University, and a PhD in Organizational Development from Benedictine University College of Business. His dissertation was on collective knowing about organizational risk, evidence from pre-financial crisis mortgage lending. It is on the failure of 5 major banks and their decision-making prior to that failure. So Dane, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for the invite. Nice to be with everybody today. Hope Hope you're surviving what's a crazy 2020. I'm going to share my screen and see if you can see this. All right, I'm gonna do an experiment. Jim, you tell me if this makes it easier to see or harder to see. Is that bigger or smaller?
I think that one is easier.
Okay. Let me try settings. Okay. All right. Good. All right. Well, thank you. Wanted to talk about something that consumed about I don't know, 7 years of my life. It was a dissertation that I wrote, and it was about how organizations make sense of and manage risk in organizations. It was something that I was always intrigued by as somebody who manages in organizations and helps leaders navigate organizations, and specifically around risk. So I wanted to share some of the findings, and not only in terms of talking about what I've studied, but what I think it means, especially for a modern era where all of us are living with and trying to doing our best to navigate through risk. So a little bit about me, as Jim said, I've got a background in financial services and management consulting. So I've spent probably about 20 years now in financial services. All of my academic background is in how organizations behave and how they change. And a little bit about me, I would say my hobbies are travel, running, and family. And I was actually looking for a picture that would sort of pull all that together. And I have one picture where I had to travel to Columbus to go running in the OSU 4-miler with my family, and there's Jim and I. So I'd say 2020 has not been so great on the travel front, but you know, there's always next year. So my research really was trying to pull together all that I learned in my, say, more than 30 years of work experience. I'll leave it at that, and all of my studies, and really try to pull that together and to really contribute something useful to what we know about knowledge and risk and how to manage risk in organizations. So my research is about what does it mean to collectively know about risk in organizations. So as a starting point, all of you work in different organizations, or you have worked in different organizations. Risk is everywhere, and managing risk in organizations is really essential if you want to survive and thrive. So, you know, when we think about risk in organizations, depending on what industry you've spent time in and what type of organization, a small organization or a large one, organizations today have to worry about cyber incidents. You don't want to get hacked, business interruptions through, you know, pandemics. Changes in legislation and regulation have a big impact on organizations, natural catastrophes, and market shifts. Everybody's worried in financial services where I work. Everybody's really worried about what will happen when non-traditional players come in and change how we compete. Amazon is changing how we compete as a bank. Facebook is changing how we compete as a bank. There are technology companies that we didn't hear of 5 years ago that are changing how we compete as a bank. And so that notion of sort of the nature of a competitive disruption is also a risk. So there are a lot of risks, and risks are indeed everywhere, and yet we've got to figure out how to manage it. In financial services, there's a very interesting relationship between risk and success. We like to think in many industries about managing risk or eliminating risk. In financial services, you know, in the insurance world, we make money by understanding risk and intelligently managing risk. And so that question of how we balance risk and return really is relevant for modern times. What's interesting is that over time, after losses and financial losses and reputational hits and disasters, organizations had really come to invest quite a lot in managing risk. So there's a whole structure that exists, especially in financial services where I work, called enterprise risk management. So there's a whole set of activities and people and departments that are responsible for how we understand risk, how we measure it, how we decide how much risk we want to take. We measure how we're actually doing, and we decide if we actually have to do something about risk. So enterprise risk management didn't exist as we think of it today 20 years ago, but it's really come out of prior crises and a reality that we're living in a complex world. So there's a lot of lingo about risk mitigation, acceptance, calculation. There's a theme in all of this, which is we're going to measure it, we're going to manage it, we're going to make it precise. We want to get our arms around it, and we want to control it, right? So that's the language that comes out of enterprise risk management. And so that's relevant because what that means is as we're engaging in enterprise risk management, we're learning a lot about the risks that we face. And then the question is, what are we doing with that risk, and how are we evaluating it? So organizations, despite all of that investment, will face scrutiny, and oftentimes they'll face penalty when the risk is mismanaged, especially when the risk impacts others. So whether you have a high-profile disaster that comes out of the middle of nowhere, the Deepwater Horizon or 3 Mile Island a couple generations ago, or healthcare risk, or the financial crisis, we think we know how to manage risk, and then something happens, and there's a lot of scrutiny. There's a lot at stake for getting it right, and especially when, if you mismanage risk and you incur a lot of loss at a bank, you'll hear from the board of directors and you'll hear from the shareholders. When you create risk that impacts the larger society, you'll hear from the media, you'll hear from regulators, you'll hear from the public. And so there's a lot at stake to getting it right. And these things keep happening even as we're investing so much to manage and calculate risk. So the paradox then becomes, how well do we really understand how to manage risk? So it's kind of a paradox. Organizations are incented to manage risk well. Yeah, in an insurance company, if you manage your insured pool well, you'll make returns for your investors. But also, organizations do invest a lot to manage risk. And yet they're regularly confronted with examples where risk was ignored, it wasn't well understood, it got out of control. And then when organizations are confronted with that, when they have to face the consequences of how they manage risk, a common refrain is, hey, nobody could have known this, right? This came out of the middle of nowhere. Some cases, if you're trying to explain the Deepwater Horizon, there are a lot of small things that added up, and all of a sudden something blew up, and you're like, nobody could have known. And that notion of, well, what does it mean to know about risk? And that was the question I was trying to study, is what does it mean beyond just putting numbers in a spreadsheet and calculating risk? What does it mean for organizations to know about risk? Because to know about risk means you can actually do something about it. So one of the really sort of frame-breaking ways that I entered my study and the research that I did is recognizing that organizations know about risk in multiple ways. When executives are talking to a board of directors or they're talking to shareholders through an earnings call, they'll talk about their calculations, they'll talk about the measurement of how much credit loss we're taking or how much environmental hazard we might be creating, and they're measuring it. They're trying to create an aura of rationality. We can calculate it, we can control it. We know if we're hitting up against the threshold. That's an objective measurement, right? And in the corporate world, that's very dominant in how we think about risk. But there are other ways that we can think about risk as well. The second is this notion of practice. Less common in academia, or less common in the corporate world, but people who research risk in organizations and research knowledge recognize that organizations can learn and know about things, know about risk through practice, meaning we learn it by working, we share it through working. So some really interesting research in, for example, a really groundbreaking study on Italian construction workers who learned not to trust corporate management and safety protocols because they felt that the safety protocols really didn't reflect what it was like to be on the ground in Italy constructing buildings. And so safety briefings didn't come in the form of a corporate training class where everybody learned sort of how to manage risk. You learned risk, and you learned to manage risk by talking to your coworkers on the construction site, meaning you learned it through practice. There's a great book, if you ever have a chance to read it, called Talking About Machines, and it was a multi-year study of Xerox copier technicians who were sent out to these jobs. They were sent out to repair copiers. They had instruction manuals on how to sort of manage risk with copy machines and how to fix copy machines. What the technicians found is the manuals were completely useless for most scenarios they encountered. The way that they learned and the way that they learned how to navigate around problems was talking to one another, right? So this notion of practice. It doesn't matter what the corporate headquarters was actually writing down and sort of codifying as a way to manage risk. What they learned was it's when you're in the moment during doing the work. There's a third way that we know about risk, which is through discourse, or how we talk about risk. And so we can talk about risk, and we can introduce discourse in talking about something as risky or not risky. And the way we talk about it shapes our reality of it. So if you were walking through an airport and you saw that bag sitting there unattended, you would probably today in 2020, well, assuming you were still in an airport in 2020, but pretend that you were, you would think to yourself, that is risky. Why? Because if you see something, say something, right? You have a discourse that says, wait a minute, that bag could have an explosive in it. There could be something wrong. This could be setting off a security incident. In 1970, that was also true, but how we talk about that now is different. And the way we talk about risk influences how we perceive risk or how we know risk. So my research was really trying to say, well, wait a minute, we know about risk and we evaluate risk through objective calculation, through practice, and through discourse, or through the way we talk about it. But how do we pull that together in a way that so we can better understand risk? What I found when I went to look at the existing research in risk and risk knowledge is this was very fragmented. There wasn't really a way to pull this together. So I wanted to find a field or a study or a case to look at an opportunity to pull these together and to integrate these perspectives so that we really understood how to manage risk. So my study was looking at mortgage lending for higher risk loans leading up to the financial crisis. So I'll use a term called higher risk mortgage lending. This is not your typical run-of-the-mill mortgage loan that, say, your family would take out. In the mid-2000s, this was a loan made to borrowers with credit scores that had, say, blemished credit scores. They had a history of financial problems. So subprime borrower was somebody who had a credit score that was pretty low that lenders would normally think twice before they made a loan to. And then there was another category, the industry called it Alt-A. This was really driving efficiencies by reducing the amount of due diligence that was put into creating a mortgage. So for example, if somebody were to, if I were to go apply for a mortgage loan, and instead of documenting my income and documenting my assets and doing the things that a bank would normally expect me to do, the bank would say, okay, you're a school teacher. How much money do you make a year? And I would say $300,000, and they'd say, okay, $300,000, right? So this notion that we're sort of reducing the amount of due diligence meant we were taking more risk, right? So there were a lot of practices that were going on in that time to grow this market, because it was a way to make more mortgages to help grow the market. And when you look at the percentage of higher risk mortgage lending, what you see is in this period between 2003 and 2008, there's a pretty substantial increase in the amount of mortgages that were made to this segment of the market, and then it started to decline pretty rapidly. But my case study was really looking at, okay, so these loans were inherently more risky, yet there was a pretty substantial increase in how much money capital we were sort of offering these borrowers. What was going on there, and how were lenders evaluating risk? So in this, it's a 5-year timeline. But basically, what motivated this was after a record refinance year, anybody who probably wanted a mortgage in 2003 got one. Anybody who had been thinking about refinancing because of low rates had pretty much gotten one, and there weren't many more mortgages to make. So the industry started to look at higher risk lenders or borrowers, families and borrowers that normally wouldn't get a mortgage but were interested in one. They just had tougher credit profiles. So the industry started to expand into that. Wall Street jumped in where Wall Street normally didn't make many loans. There was a theory in this that there was more money to be made by offering to higher risk borrowers higher risk, higher returns. So this notion of a risk-adjusted return. So there was a huge growth, and it was easy to do because house prices were appreciating. So you're loaning based on sort of a increased value of your house, so that makes it easier to lend. That worked as long as house prices kept appreciating. Sooner or later, that stopped. Lenders began to fail. The riskiest part of the market, subprime, began to freeze. Borrowers were not interested in, investors were not interested in lending money anymore to that part of the market. And then eventually you start some high-profile failures, and then eventually the market went into a global financial crisis. And the government, not only the U.S. government, but most governments around the world had to intervene at some point. So the couple things to know about this, and what I think this is a really interesting, why did I choose this versus, say, other industries? Relative to, say, an oil rig platform that all of a sudden blows up because of things, combination of things, this was something that had been accumulating over time. So what was interesting about this was that there were voices along the way every year from 2003, a big spike between 2004, 2005, going, I'm not sure this is a really good idea to be lending so much to higher risk borrowers. Yes, housing prices are going up, but this is a bubble, right? So bubbles go up and then they pop and then they come back down. And so there was this increasing journalists, economists, industry pundits that were all sort of weighing in, and I went back and counted the number of times some prominent figures mentioned a housing bubble. And so what you saw is we were talking about risk for quite a while. This was going on for a while, and it was getting more pronounced. And so it's an interesting opportunity to study, well, wait a minute. If people were saying this was not going to end well, how did we keep going for so long, right? It might tell us something about how we think about risk. I mentioned earlier about housing prices. So housing prices were on this huge upward trajectory for a long time. My case study starts here in 2004 when this is just an index of, house price increases from one quarter to the next. What you saw was this huge run up. And so lenders saw this and they saw this as, okay, borrowers are increasing the value of their house and we can lend money against that. That's equity in a house. And then it peaked in about 2006 and then it stopped. And then my case study ends here. And you can see this, there was a very rocky period. So when we say there was a bubble, you look back and you say, well, objectively, yeah, that looks like a classic bubble. And it was public information. And so this wasn't something that was opaque or hard to understand, especially if you were in lending money for mortgages. So what was interesting about that is, given all of that talk in the industry, my study was really trying to understand, what does it mean for organizations to know about risk? So this was interesting. I went back and collected a lot of quotes over a course of a 5-year period. This was one that, about Countrywide Financial, which was, at the time, it was the largest mortgage lender in the country. It was since bought out by Bank of America, so after 2008, it didn't exist anymore. So I was looking at how Countrywide was talking about risk to its investors on earning calls. I was also looking at how they were talking about risk internally, because some of the investigations after the financial crisis unearthed a whole lot of internal communications that were going on. So I was looking at this notion about how is Countrywide talking about the risk it was taking. And so there's some internal emails from 2006. The CEO of the mortgage company said, in all of my years in the business, I've never seen a more toxic product. This was a higher risk product that they were originating. The CEO very clearly saw what was going on with real estate values coming down and rising interest rates. This product's going to perform worse. Our integrity is too important to me. And so he's putting it out there. This is the CEO talking to his own people. In 2007, after some of the initial losses started to wave in and investors were on these earning calls going, what were you thinking? His response, Angelo Mazzillo's same response is, nobody saw this coming. S&P, Moody's, the rating agencies didn't see this coming. Wall Street didn't see this coming. Would we do things differently? Absolutely, if we knew back then what we know now, but the fact is we didn't know. So look at that, that's just a year later. And then after the crisis, when the congressional inquiries were happening, they looked back and they said, country as early as 2004, these executives knew what they were originating could lead to catastrophic consequences. And they noted that high-risk mortgage loans, were going to really hurt families, but they didn't stop. And so you look at these, and this is really over a 4-year period. The way we were talking about what we knew was so different, and it sets up a paradox. So how did they think about what they knew? And so that really was sort of the motivating piece for my study. So in academic terms, my research question was how organizations evaluate and act on knowledge regarding risks, and I sort of defined what those terms are. What I did was use case studies. So as Jim said up at the top of the hour, I looked at 5 lenders, and I was looking at how they were talking about risk on their earnings calls. Earnings calls are a really interesting way to talk about that, because equity analysts, who have to make stock recommendations, have public, recorded calls with these executives for 2 hours at a time on a quarterly basis, and they'll ask about risk. And the questions are unprompted, and the executives have to answer. And if executives make misstatements on those calls, they're subject to prosecution. So it's an interesting sort of truth-telling that exists for these lenders, and there was a lot in there. There were 2 case studies, Countrywide Financial and Washington Mutual, neither of which exist today, that had a lot of internal emails unearthed through congressional investigations. As a researcher, that's a gold mine because they were talking about risk in some very direct, blunt ways. And it was an interesting way to compare how they were talking about risk publicly and how they were talking about risk privately. So I was looking at the financial services market and the mortgage market's a really complex market. I was really looking at the part of the market where a lender makes a loan to a family or to a borrower. There's a lot that happens after the fact with what happens to that mortgage. I was less interested in that because the lenders were the ones who were watching what was going on with the borrowers. And so I had Countrywide Financial and Washington Mutual because I had a lot of data about them. I was also looking for comparison at Chase, IndyMac, which doesn't exist anymore, and Citi, which does. And it was pulling different types of information about them. So to start, what I did is I thought about when we say risk in organizations, I had to define what risk was. In the financial world, you have to worry about that the borrower may not repay, that the borrower may be making fraudulent claims, a mortgage broker could be making fraudulent claims, house prices could decline. So there's all sorts of ways that risk can play out, and I had to think about each one and identify. I have to know what you're looking for, you have to define the risk. So I went back to 5 years of financial disclosures. This took a little bit of time. For five lenders over 5 years. And then I was also looking at internal emails, annual reports, strategic plans where I could. I was really trying to pull as many different data sources. I had 265 unique data sources for this. And what I was looking for was not only quantitative calculations, but the way they were talking about risk. And so a couple things that really came out of my research. One, when you look, and what I did is for each quarter, I sort of listed out, and then I listed how many times did I find in incidents where a lender or executives were talking about a unique type of risk. The first real finding was that lenders were talking plenty about the risk they were taking. Risk taking was part of their strategy. They were clearly worried about some of the risks that they were taking well before it became a problem. So they were thinking about this, talking about it, evaluating risk. It wasn't as if it came as a complete surprise. What it was also doing was looking at how lenders were framing and evaluating risk. Lenders were using different lenses or frames to talk about risk. For example, a lender might say, well, yeah, we're increasing our credit risk, but our credit risk is better than our competitors, so therefore our stock is better. Or yeah, risk increased this quarter, but if you were to look back 5 years, it's not that big of an increase, right? So there were all sorts of frames that they were using to say this risk is a big deal or it's not a big deal, and those frames changed over time. Couple things in terms of what does this mean? Lenders, when they were thinking about evaluating risk, and when I say what does it mean to collectively evaluate risk, lenders were because they have to, they were calculating risk in the way that you would think. They were writing down numbers, they were taking measurements, they were trying to be very objective, and because they have to, SEC reporting requirements force them to do that. There were also other narratives. There were ways that they were talking about risk that were also influential. One is there was a lot of narrative about their competency in managing risk. Lenders up front were very confident that even though they were going to this very high-risk market, they had a lot of confidence. They also recognized that there were some forces beyond the lender's control. If house prices started declining after a long run, there's not much a lender can do about that. A lender doesn't control house prices. So there's external risk. And then there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of, when house prices started to decline, it wasn't clear if that was a temporary dip or if it was going to come back or if this was as good as it was going to get and it was all going to go downhill from there. So there's uncertainty. So that was one narrative. The second narrative was there were a lot of competing arguments going on in these organizations around what's the right way to frame risk. Do we think about bracketing in terms of one time period, another? Are we comparing, are we differentiating between ourselves and the market? And is that relevant? Are we differentiating if our risk is increasing, but it's still lower than what we expected? Is that okay? And then there was a lot of, later on, there's a lot of focus on, okay, we've made some adjustments we've tightened our credit standards. We're not going to lend to very, very risky borrowers. So we're going to tighten standards. So don't evaluate us based on all those bad decisions in the past. Just evaluate us based on our new criteria. So I call that bifurcation. So the key point is there were a lot of arguments going on inside these firms and with their stakeholders about what is the right way to frame risk. And you would think to yourself, well, that's objective, right? There should be an objective standard. When you're in an uncertain period, these frames can get used and argued and refined quite rapidly over time. And the third narrative that was going on was there was a perceived legitimacy of risk-taking. So the industry, as I said up top, had a dominant logic, and that logic is risk-adjusted return. If I lend to a borrower that has a poor credit score, or I don't force them to document all their income, I accept that they're making $300,000 as a school teacher, I'm going to charge them greater interest rates. I'm going to charge them more fees. I'm going to make more money. So there was a logic that said risk-adjusted return, and that logic was very compelling. It was shared across the industry, and it led lenders to not think about alternatives to risk-taking. Like, what else? How else could we make money in this market other than just lending to high-risk borrowers? It became this idea that this was the way to make money. There was legitimacy was also influenced by stakeholders. So you would see evidence of whether a board would start asking questions. Here's the way this would play out. A board would see an article in the Wall Street Journal talking about the way that their competitor was harming borrowers through predatory loans, and then the board would start asking the executives to identify whether that's existing here. And so this chain of, when other stakeholders started getting nervous, executives started paying more attention to risk. And then the third part of legitimacy was there was a lot of I know this will shock you. There's a lot of political jockeying amongst the executives in terms of whose views about risk really counted more. Was it the chief risk officer? Very seldom. In some cases, what was interesting was that in my countrywide example, the CEO was raising the alarm about risk, and his own management team was ignoring him. Political influence, it wasn't necessarily a function of what your title is. It was who could best represent industry thinking, who had the relationships out in the industry, whose views prevailed. That was it proved to be a really important point. The last thing I would say here is, the arrows at the bottom say, how influential was this over time in an organization's risk-taking? Organizations started out early on saying, we know how to handle risk. Nobody knows how to manage this kind of risk better than we do. You know, as things happened, that waned over time. In contrast, there was a lot of jockeying around narratives around risk, and this idea of competing frames, different ways of thinking about risk, got very intense over time. There were arguments even between equity analysts and executives. Internal to the company, there were arguments between the chief risk officer, the chief sales officer, and the chief executive officer. And then the perceived legitimacy of risk-taking, boards of directors and business media and shareholders loved risk-adjusted return. They loved the idea of making more money by making higher risk loans until they didn't, right? And so that idea of stakeholder legitimacy wasn't necessarily just one direction. Over time, the idea of do you really know what you're doing shifted, and so the legitimacy of this kind of risk-taking fell. And so, you know, where I'll end here is to say, so what, if you're trying to manage risk in organizations, what does my study suggest? So a couple things. One is, as I said before, lenders were talking about risk early on. It wasn't as if they didn't know about risk. The second point is that the way they were evaluating risk was not formulaic. It was not objective. It's not the way that they like to talk about the risk process. We're going to put it in a database. We're going to calculate values. We're going to look at trends. We're going to line it up against a threshold. It was a process, right? And so that process was subject to sort of a lot of social influence. The industry's logic at the time, risk-adjusted returns, had no exit triggers. As you know, all of you know, because you've been in organizations, any good strategy has exit criteria. How do you know when it's time to get out of this strategy and go do something different? There is no exit criteria in this. And what that meant was lenders couldn't think about an alternative way to make money. The irony was that there were so many people, so many competitors. Wall Street was jumping in. All these players were jumping into this market, trying to chase this higher margin type of loan, that the profit margins for this segment of the market, this higher risk, pretty much evaporated. There was a point where you weren't really making that much more money, if any extra money, by taking this higher risk, yet you're sort of taking on a lot of costs because these borrowers will default at a higher rate. But the lenders couldn't envision doing anything else, and that was interesting. They couldn't envision it until it was too late. The second, number four, the executives were really influenced by how stakeholders started talking about risk. When boards started questioning, when it was interesting was that it was even less than boards, they were really sensitive to an article in the Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg about how Bank of America was treating borrowers, and it led, when stakeholders began shifting their views, that was what triggered executives to start paying more attention. And the last piece of this is because collective risk evaluation is a lot of conversation, it's a lot of shifting frames for how you think about risk. It's also political, and people who study organizations don't like to talk about politics in organizations. There was a lot of politics in what was going on here. So in terms of what can you do, what would you do, what can we learn, how do we do better? First, strategies really need to, they need to have clear exit clauses around risk. How do you know when it's time to get out? Second is, risk is not just, as I said, sort of calculating and writing things down and putting things in a spreadsheet or a table. Risk is a conversation, and it's a contest of ideas. And that idea of how do we think about risk is very much a conversation and a contest of ideas. Third is that conversation about risk really needs to include influential stakeholders, because they clearly have a say in how an organization is managing risk that may have nothing to do with the numbers that are written down. It's perception of risk, which can be equally meaningfully. And the fourth, as in all things in organization, you're naive if you go into something like risk evaluation, risk measurement, and you're not thinking about the political influence of who stands to gain from continuing to pursue risk versus putting on the brakes. And understanding that as a potential for political influence also gives you clues about how you manage it. So a lot there. What's interesting is as I look at this and I said, you know, how does this apply to what we know today in terms of some of the early insights around the pandemic, or even if something as useful as, you know, I often have to evaluate technology projects going in. Technology projects in my organization are always green, they're on plan, they're on budget, they're on schedule, and then they're late. And it comes out of the woodwork and it's a surprise. And this notion about how do we manage risk while we see it and how do we get ahead of it is really key to make sure that we don't have things blowing up in organizations and we're not creating harm. So my study was a start of that, and I hope you found it useful. I haven't left a lot of time for questions, but I'd love to hear any feedback or reactions.
Dane, you had mentioned the whole issue of risk and implementation of especially IT and new strategy. How would you suggest we answer that first question of what are some of the exit strategies do we need to have and when to plug them in? If we were, let's
Yeah,
say,
I think part of that is understanding when having clear, knowing what your risk appetite is. So that today we talk about risk as a risk appetite. We'll accept credit losses beyond a certain point, and then we'll exit that product. Or a technology project that goes from requiring 6 months to 12 months is okay, but if it goes beyond 12 months, we have to come up with a different approach, right? So that notion of exit criteria really becomes important. I'll share my screen again. So that's part of it, and then the second is also thinking about what are other ways that we could achieve our goals that have a different risk profile to them, right? So the hard part with organizations is they're recognizing that their current strategy is too risky, but they haven't really invested any time in thinking about alternatives. And as you probably know, when you can think about a second alternative or a third alternative, you can have a backup plan. You can have a plan B or a plan C. That's really important. Because what it means is you don't feel so dug into what you're doing now, and that becomes really important. And that becomes an interesting oversight for boards and investors. Did that answer your question, Jim?
Mm-hmm.
Other question?
We do have a couple in the chat. Abe, go ahead if you have a question.
I have a question. I don't know if you can hear me or whatever.
I can hear you.
I'm wondering, in the current environment, you focus so much on certainty, and the current environment is absolutely one of uncertainty. How do you manage that? I mean, I think people like people who are trying to open schools in question of risk management, again, how do you manage that kind of thing? It looks like numbers don't really count that much at this particular point. You have, everything is so flexible, so fluid. It depends, it's situational. It depends on school buildings. It depends on individual districts. That's
an excellent question. That's a very timely question. Thank you for that. So opening schools is very, anybody who has children or is sending people potentially to school, we have to think about that. And I think I agree. There's one of the downsides of focusing on, I want to go back to this. One of the downsides of focusing on risk as something that you can codify and put in a spreadsheet and write down is it leads to this notion of certainty, and that, if the numbers in Microsoft Excel, so of course it must be right. No, it's just a representation of what people are that's what they understand. There's always uncertainty, and then the question is, how do you put in enough monitoring, and how do you understand what's happening? So for example, a school district could decide, they could publish their metrics of the number of people that have been exposed or new cases. We can also learn by what's actually happening in schools, right? We recognize first up front, we're not going to know it all, we're not going to get it right. But how do we really learn how to manage in the schools that are opening what's going on. That's practice, right? So how do we understand whether the children in the schools are taking precautions seriously? How do we start thinking about things that might be going on that might be influencing new cases, right? So the way we deal with uncertainty is to understand what's happening in the classroom, on the ground, and then surfacing that as a way of reducing uncertainty. And the third piece in terms of how we're talking about it is, and discourse is, we are not going to get it right up front. And then the question becomes, how do is it that we send a kid back to school when you hit a certain level, or do we talk about risk in terms of understanding that we're reducing uncertainty, we're reducing harm, and so we can introduce new language to talk about how we're managing uncertainty, which is another aspect of risk. So it's a really timely question, because the reality is no type of risk is free of uncertainty. And in my case study, there was a lot of uncertainty with just the amount of risk taking, the different types of risk taking, and how it was all adding up. That's an interesting. It's an interesting to talk about today about sending kids back to school, because you've got a lot of uncertainty. You don't know what the cleanliness conditions are in schools. You don't know how students are going to behave in a school in terms of paying attention to safety protocols. You don't know, there's a lot we still don't know about the virus itself. And so uncertainty is really part of it. And I think what that means is we have to pay attention to risk management even more than we do today.
Dane, my question is more on the real estate end of things. How do you, seeing how the environment is going today when it comes to these multiple offer situations, people outbidding each other, I mean, I don't expect you to have a crystal ball. I guess the question is, there's a lot of risk in this, and it's only getting worse with the amount of inventory we have. Yep. Do you see a trend as you're looking at this stuff? Do you see a trend that it's going to stop, or are we going to continue facing this for a while?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a fundamental economics driver behind it, which is after the financial crisis, the amount of home building dramatically stopped, right? So there was a whole construction industry that dissipated. There were a lot of workers that just were in there opportunistically. They all evaporated, and because the housing market took so long to recover, today we are all plagued by and you probably see this in your neighborhoods, there just aren't that many new houses being built, right? And so you have, every year, you've got more families that are looking to buy houses, looking to upgrade or downgrade or whatever. They're looking for new homes. There just aren't that many homes. And so if you're looking to,
I was going to say, one of the biggest problems is affordable housing. So we have issues with new builds, that there are none that are in what I would say an affordable housing area. And we also have a lot of people who are not, they're opposed to actual development to alleviate that in some of the areas that we're looking at. So it's you're hitting on an interesting policy opportunity. There's what's interesting is there's affordable housing, and then there's one of the real gaps in the market, actually, which is relevant to your question, is what's not getting built enough is the starter single family house. The young family, they just got married. They're not looking for the giant palazzo yet. That'll come later when they're making more money. They just want a affordable single family house. That's really hard to find, which because of 18 factors, there's more housing stock for people that have the 5-bedroom house that, I don't know, in Columbus probably might cost you what, $600,000 now, right? It's the everybody, yeah.
It's everybody's looking for the $300,000 house. That's really hard to come by, and it's a function of we have to think about how policy-wise we invest in that, and we got to figure out how to mix market incentives and where government can and should provide help, especially if you want your school teachers and your firefighters and your police officers to be able to afford a house in the communities where they're living.
Absolutely. And a lot of that also is to have them start their equity, because a lot of our wealth management comes from our house. And so without helping these people start their equity, it's going to be tough for them to move up in a couple of years. Right.
Yeah. And especially for, this is really, your question is really relevant. A lot of millennials and Gen Z people coming out of college, they have a ton of student debt. They don't have money to put 20% down on a house yet. How do we help them? Because your point is exactly right, Katie. Once they get into that home and they start building equity, that is how they build wealth. And so we've got to figure out how to help our young people, because the danger is if we don't, their views of home ownership start looking more pessimistic and negative, and that's not what we want.
And that's part of the problem with, I would say, a generation younger than me, and my son's generation. Why should I go out and buy, I might as well just rent and move around for a while. And you see that type of mentality happening. Not all of them, but you have that. And then the other thing I keep finding, and I find hilarious, is generational housing. You got people my age coming to me saying, hey, I need a house with a first floor master for my parents with me living on top. And
Exactly.
That's a whole different perspective too.
Yeah.
So
what I'd like to do now is if we could end the meeting and then we can continue with conversation after this.
I probably could talk to Dane for 4 hours.
That's my sense, yes. So why don't we end it here. Thank you, Dane. And want to mention that next week's speaker is Robert Fortner. He's the professor of 41 years teaching journalism and mass communication. His topic is Twitter and COVID-19, and he will share his findings about social media and our response to COVID-19. And so I'd like to move on now to the four-way test. And then afterwards, you can stick around and ask Dane more questions, and he's willing to do that, I know. But we do need to get some folks on their way. So the first question, we'll just go through this. Of the things we think, say, and do, first, is it the truth? Second,
is it fair to all concerned?
Third,
will it build goodwill and better friendships?
And fourth, will it be beneficial
to all concerned?
So thank you all for attending today. Sorry it went over a little bit. And Dane will stick around and have some discussions afterwards here. Are there, goodbye to some.
Thanks, Dane.
Yep. Is there anybody that has any?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
I do. Yeah. Dane, Pete Barnhart.
Hi there.
What connection do you feel from the 1976 to 1977 to 1980 presidency of President Carter, who, for us in the banking industry, were told you will give more mortgages. You will go out to the unqualified. And this is a decade and a half before the time that you're talking about, where we were told you shall give. And we moved from 47% house occupancy, others in apartments and such, to something in the area of 64% housing. Yep. And when the bankers looked at that, they said there's not 64%. of the American populace who can afford to be in a house. And those are the very same people who, after they got their house, said, oh, I've got to buy a hose, and I got to buy a lawnmower. I got to buy a washer and dryer, and it goes on and on and on. And those other things, you know, the full package of what it takes to own a house and operate a house really were put in jeopardy. And we saw in the early 80s the overabundance of housing and then the explosion and the downturn at that time also. And that kind of was a precept of what occurred, I think, in the early 2000s.
Yeah, so you're raising a really good question around housing policy. I'm going to thread the needle on your question because I can see it both ways. I can see pushing homeownership for people who are not ready to be homeowners is clearly, you're harming a borrower there. At the same time, when you look and you say, well, you know, when we say who is homeownership ready, you know, does that exist? Does everybody have a fair shot at home ownership and housing policy and all that? Historically, there's also been a lot of very objective data that would say, no, people, depending on sort of your neighborhood or where you live or your skin color or whatever, you haven't always had the same opportunities. The goal isn't, to your point, I think, isn't simply to say, hey, everybody should have a house even if you're not ready for it. It's how do we think about policy and homeownership education, readiness from homeownership, so that you have a house. And you know, one of the debates that happens a lot is this idea of a 20% down payment on a house. 20% means you have a financial stake in really paying your mortgage on time because you've got money at stake. There were, in the height of the pre-lending, you know, in the run-up to the financial crisis, you could get a house with no down payment. That's really risky. So the question is, how do we help, you know, to Katie's question, how do we help more people get at least money down? And that's where maybe it's government's involvement or nonprofits' involvement is helping to educate borrowers, helping them build a nest egg, maybe down payment assistance or something, but some combination of policy so that they really are ready when they get it. And that's how I think I don't think the industry has gotten it right. And I think that's the heart of your question. And I'm not sure the government has always thought clearly about that. But I think there's an opportunity, but we've got to do better as a country at helping everybody who can be ready, get ready, because once you're in a house, it's just as true today as it was back in 1970. It is a great way to build family wealth. We just have to do it right.
Right, I agree. Thank you.
I'm sorry, but my Wi-Fi is squirrely. So while you were talking and answering the question, it just went away. So I'm sorry, but that's okay. Life is uncertain. Life is risky. How do you, you know? Anyway, okay, I'm leaving now. Thanks. I'm sorry I dropped off, but.
No, no worries. Well, we can hear you now. Good. Any other questions? There were a couple. That came over the chat. So I can answer those, or if you have other ones.
Wayne? Roger Johnson, can you hear me?
Yeah.
You can? I emailed you today.
Oh, hi. Yeah.
Anyway, you know, one of the things you left out is the government intervention. Like Pete was saying, I dealt with over 200 financial institutions over 50 years in the mortgage area. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine.
Okay. And what happened, the government, the examiners would come into those companies, and if they didn't make certain loans, they got ostracized, or they couldn't open up a branch. And that's what you left out. And another mortgage banker, I dealt with they had to actually go out and train people to make mortgage loans. They didn't understand it. The government was there, and they had, they taught them you have to make a payment. So that's what I recognize in dealing with all these bankers.
Yeah. Yeah, what you're referring to is the Community Reinvestment Act, right? This idea
CRA.
that, right, CRA, right? And so it says, hey, banks have this obligation to loan and invest and do business in the communities that where they serve, right? And you can't sort of pick and choose where you do business. And again, I'll sort of thread the needle on this. There were some banks that were very, redlining, right? There were banks that were very blatant about redlining. There were other banks that were, I think, to your point, that were really trying to be responsible and felt as if they were getting pushed into taking risks that they weren't comfortable with because they were simply trying to meet a CRA goal. And the CRA goal, if they failed on their CRA goals, they couldn't open branches or they couldn't acquire other institutions, right? So again, it's a hard problem, and I think it's relevant here. In some sense, expanding out the population that takes advantage of banking or the population that gets a loan is about taking more risk. But how do we do it intelligently, right? And industry hasn't always gotten it right. Government hasn't always gotten it right. But somehow we've got to learn from this and get better and create the outcomes that we want, which is families do end up doing better and they build more wealth if they are responsible in taking out mortgages and using financial products. How do we get there? And I think that's all of our challenge.
Agree.
Agree with me?
Yep. Is Doug still on?
Nope, Doug's gone. What did he ask, by the way?
He was asking about, I mentioned in my study, I was looking at lenders like Countrywide and lenders like Chase that were actually making the loans for the mortgage. One of the interesting aspects about the industry at this time is this idea that they were, a company like Countrywide was making the mortgage and then they were just selling it off out to Wall Street, right? And so they were immediately, the argument was at the time was, wait a minute, so Countrywide had every incentive to take risk because they could just make a high risk mortgage and get rid of it and just sell it out to the Wall Street, right? Wall Street, they would chop up these mortgages in terms of financial tranches and all that. After a while, it was like scrapple. You didn't know what you were buying, right? It had no correlation to real risk. That was clearly a part of the market, and there were some people who researched the financial crisis who said, well, that was the reason that Countrywide made those mortgages, right? They didn't have any risk. There was always some residual risk that lenders had to take. If the mortgages went bad, Wall Street could say, you got to buy these loans back. Oftentimes you had to hold a small residual from those loans that you sold on your balance sheet. And that was just the way that accounting requirements worked. So there was some risk. And so lenders like Countrywide at the time had to be careful, even if they were selling the loans out to the market. But Doug asked a really good question. And then Katie asked, is the current mortgage environment different than it was 10 years ago? Yes and no. We certainly have learned from the market. There is still high-risk lending going on. I would say in 2020, ironically, 2020, I don't know what you've seen in your local markets, but the pandemic has not slowed home buying down. If anything, rates are so low that anybody who can refi probably should refi if you can work your way through and if your closing costs are worth it. But I'd say the industry has learned quite a lot. The financial industry is also an industry that sort of relearns its lessons about every 15 or 20 years.